Hello, my name is Margarita Rovenskaya, and I'm the president of the Piano Teachers Congress, which is a nonprofit. It's almost 100 years old. Will be 102 years. But we are a nonprofit that offers opportunities for teachers in the tri-state area. We have student programs, and we have 6 professional workshops throughout the year, and this is our final one, so it's very exciting for us. You can check out our website. We have some brochures on the music stand, and if you'd like to look up our website, you can see all of our student programs which happen throughout the year, mostly in the spring, and also our professional development workshops with multiple venues in New York City. We're very lucky. So one of these venues is Klavierhaus. I want to thank them especially for hosting us today. It's a real honor to be here. And I want to introduce Jed Distler, who is the artistic director of Salon Concerts, and he's going to tell us a little bit about Klavierhaus. Thank you, Jed.
Thank you, Rita. It's wonderful to see all of you this morning. And Klavierhaus is one of New York's major, in fact, I think the major business for restoring vintage instruments. And they do absolutely wonderful, wonderful work. And after the talk today, I invite you to take a look at the instruments because there are some really wonderful vintage Steinways and Faziolis, and also there's a lot of work with period instruments. And also you can take a look at the inventory of instruments on the Klavierhaus website, which is klavierhaus.com. And the proprietor, Sujatri Reisinger, has been, and his team do wonderful, wonderful work. And he's out of town at the moment, but definitely you should, take a look. And if you need really first-rate, world-class restoration, this is the place to go. And I can tell you that firsthand. I've always been very happy, and they have been very generous in giving us the space for the Salon Concerts series, which was started by our late and much missed friend Joe Patridge, who I'm sure all of you knew. And he started this series 2 years ago to give emerging artists and pianists who don't always get to play in New York an opportunity to showcase their artistry. And James Wu, who is in charge of the live stream and the producer and who basically keeps this place running, he is in charge of the high definition live streams that we have for all of our concerts, and as well as for this event today. And I'm very excited that Rita and I, we've been speaking about partnering and to present live streams of these events on our Salon Concerts YouTube channel. I'm very excited about that because I think we want to expand our concert series into educational projects, including lectures and masterclasses. So I thank you all for coming, and please take a look at the Salon Concerts website. And if you have questions, you can speak to James later. Unfortunately, I have a rehearsal I have to run out to that I'm playing at today. But the concerts take place Sundays at 2 o'clock, and our last one on the series is June 9th. We resume in September 8th through the end of May 2025, and we have a wonderful, wonderful roster of artists, and I'll let you know all about that, and I look forward to being in touch with all of you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Jed. I also want to add that I believe Spencer is playing on the Salon Concerts as well. And what day is that? So May 26th, you should all be back here for a wonderful performance of Debussy Preludes. Yes. Wonderful. You don't miss it. You should be here. Yes. It is my immense pleasure to introduce Spencer Myer, who is a phenomenal pianist and incredible teacher. I know firsthand because I studied with him for a semester at Oberlin, and it was incredible. Not only is he a wonderful pianist and teacher and person, but he is also a competition laureate. He has won the New Orleans and performed all over the world with orchestras such as Cleveland and South Africa, and generally just a gem of a person and a pianist. And I'm just so thrilled to hear him perform today and speak to us about muscle memory. And here we go. Spencer, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. Getting used to this apparatus for the live stream, so excuse me, but it's great to see you all here. Familiar faces, some new faces. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to talk today about a lot of concepts that I'm sure a lot of you use in your own practice and in dealing with your students, but it's kind of a different way of looking at things in a way. And I formulated this lecture based on a period of my life where I was doing a lot of competitions and practicing in a way for these competitions that I found much more scrutinizing to myself, being that in competitions, of course, as we all know, when we play in a competition and the jury is there, there's that extra pressure to play perfectly and to not have a memory slip and to not miss a note, because there's this emphasis on perfection in competitions, which is unfortunate, but a reality. So I found myself in practice being so demanding on myself to reach these heights of perfection that I really started to delve deeply into how I was practicing and to always question what I was doing, especially when I found myself being habitual in my practice and being repetitive, which is pertaining to muscle memory. So I want to talk today about muscle memory. I call it muscle memory, friend or foe, because I'm going to briefly address, of course, how we can use muscle memory to our advantage. It can be a friend, but most of the lecture is going to be revolving around how we get away from muscle memory and how we can engage our brain so that our brain is actually always engaged and always functioning at our utmost on stage. So I found people often ask us, I think, in general, how we memorize. And I found that I have generally answered that memory on stage is about 80% muscle memory, because we do mostly repetitive practice. And the 20% of this remaining 20% is where we really find our mental solidity. So, and this is where the important practice, as it were, comes into play. So I think it's important to address first, as I said, how muscle memory is actually good. So is it good or bad? Playing an instrument obviously is physical, and so muscle memory, I think, has to be part of the equation. There's no way we can actually get away from it. And repetitive practice is some of the best practice that we can do, of course. I find, of course, it's something we can draw on, in particular when we're having a memory slip. I find that often when I'm on stage and I feel a memory slip coming on, if I can find some way to zone myself out, to think about the laundry or think about what I'm having for lunch the next day or whatever, I can find myself back and get out of the memory slip by tapping into my muscle memory and going on autopilot for a second. And I find that extremely useful. So that's one way in which I actually use muscle memory. And also, I think we've all heard that scientific studies have shown that it's impossible for our brain actually to think about two things at once. It's impossible to actually multitask. So when we're playing the piano, there is some element always that is on autopilot. So we are always using our muscle memory, okay? So this is just these points that I just addressed. And again, I think so I think what I'm going to talk about today about getting away from muscle memory, it's always important to tie in to our thoughts, how we can use the muscle memory as well to our advantage. So the idea of removing muscle memory has to do with developing and increasing the brain's involvement in our memory. So how I found in my practice, especially as I said in preparing for these competitions, I found what I was most often asking myself is, how can I make a passage feel different or foreign to my body so that my brain is forced to engage. So I think this is generally the concept that we want to revolve around, and you'll hear me repeat this phrase, the brain's engagement, I think a lot during this hour. The inaction and the engagement of our brain is so important on stage, and I think it's something that it's the trap that we can fall into with muscle memory, is that our brain completely checks out. So doing this in our practice is so important. So I thought the first thing that I would address is slow practice. It's really the most obvious example of changing a physical sensation, and I think this is the point that is most pertaining to what I said at the beginning, something that we all do in our practice, something that we tell our students to do, but this is now a different way of looking at it. It's obviously a very useful tool for drilling and refining the minor muscle motions when we're required to make with great speed at the piano. And I think it's often, unfortunately, looked on by us and our students as a tedious, a mindless exercise for developing solidity. And we all know it works, of course, but the thing we want to think about is that it actually engages the brain, because when we practice slowly, not only are we changing the physical sensation, but practicing slowly, we are forcing our fingers and our brain to think about what the next note is, because we're slowing down the process. So I thought I would just demonstrate, and by the way, I know you can't see the keyboard, but none of my demonstrations are really technical. It's all about listening to how these happen. So really the seeing of the keyboard is not important. So Chopin First Impromptu, for example. When I practice slowly, and we'll talk in a bit about consistent tempos in slow practice, which I think is not always important. I think we can often fall into the trap of choosing a slow tempo when we practice slowly, and I talk to my students about this all the time. What tempo do you practice when you practice slowly? And they demonstrate, and it's always, they have chosen a tempo to practice slowly, and I think that's very important to vary as well. So again, in practicing slowly, I'm increasing the moments exponentially in which my brain has to think about what the next note is. So I find immediately I am exposing for myself and for my brain the small moments where I don't quite know that next note, and I have to stop and review that. So the slow practice in that way, using it as an actual brain exercise and not a tedious exercise of repetition, is so useful in really engaging our brain. So, yes. So is a consistent tempo important in slow practice? I think to answer this question, we really need to ask, what are we trying to achieve by slow practice? So are we trying to achieve steadiness of tempo? Not necessarily, because we're going for solidifying our technique and solidifying our memory and making sure that we are thinking about what the next note is. So steadiness of tempo and drilling the idea of a steadiness of tempo is not necessarily what we're going for. What we are going for is physical and mental solidity. So another thing pertaining to this that I think is important to address is, are the physical gestures the same when we practice slow? And I think, of course, there are some variations, but I think to try to emulate as much as possible the physical gestures when we are at 100% tempo, when we practice slowly, is very important. So the way I move my arm for the turning of a phrase or the turning of a certain passage, I try to emulate that as much as possible when I'm practicing slowly. And I also, we could go into a whole different lecture about this, but I think that's very important also to do with ourselves and our students in the first stages of learning a piece, to really specify that choreography when we're learning something at a slow tempo. How is it going to feel when we play faster, and how much more similarly can we do that? Can we identify and specify how we're going to move in order to reach our goal? So then specifically, another technique I actually consciously use is inconsistent tempos. So this is very similar to slow practice, where our brain is forced to think about the next note. But what I love about inconsistent tempos in practicing slowly, or not necessarily a very slow tempo, is that it forces the exploration of phrasing and musical intent which also further engages the brain. So we can just kind of play and explore. So again, using the first Chopin impromptu, now we have... just changing and being very spontaneous. The spontaneity is something I find is very important in this type of practice, where we're, again, getting ourselves away from the muscle memory and out of the trap of the muscle memory, to always be changing. And again, I think even in something as random, per se, as inconsistent tempos, we can fall into a habit. So it's always important to be changing and to be spontaneous and to be thus stimulating your brain that way. So also, I thought I would maybe demonstrate the middle section of the second scherzo. So really, again, very exploratory and very spontaneous. But again, the fact that the tempos are inconsistent, it's out of the habit of how I'm used to practicing, and it's thus forcing my brain to be always engaged in every moment, thinking about what the next note is. So, we're going one by one now. Good. Let me go back to that. So very similar to slow practice, where our brain is being forced to think about the next note, and even better, allowing us to explore and really our phrasing and our musical intent. So, alternating rhythms. Another thing I think we all do, we all tell our students to do, the dotted rhythms when we're practicing scales and whatnot. But again, this is something we tell our students to do and that we do ourselves for drilling purposes. So it becomes somewhat mindless, but it is an amazing brain exercise due to the changing of the physicality. Because if you practice a scale in a dotted rhythm, for example, there's every other note has a moment where you have to stop and you have to actually think. The brain has to think about what the next note is. So I find that this works the best with scale and arpeggio passages and technically challenging sections, but can really apply to so many different things. Again, with the middle section of the scherzo, dotted rhythms, and then reverse. So again, there's even at a tempo that's somewhat close to our performance tempo, there is a moment in every other note because of the dotted rhythm where you have to stop and you have to really think, and the brain has to know. And it's wonderfully exposing in your own practice and our students' practice to where those tiny little insecurities are in how we know the notes. So I was just playing Opus 90. This is the one of the treacherous sections in the middle where I practice dotted rhythms all the time. And then again, reverse. No, I just had a little slip. Don't quite know the left hand, so I have to review the left hand a little bit. It's just wonderfully exposing. A lot of these techniques feel terrible the first time you do them, but then getting used to them, you embrace the feeling of discomfort and getting over that, and really, again, it just solidifies the brain so well. With alternating rhythms, we can do dotted rhythms in reverse, like I just did. And now I'm going to demonstrate also with triplets, changing the length of each chosen third on the triplet. So the first Chopin impromptu is based in triplets. So we have stopping on the first note, and then stopping on the second note, and then third note. Very useful, and again, very wonderfully uncomfortable in your practice, but it's just the solidifying that you can feel in the moment of your brain is so comforting in a way. And then same with groups of four. For example, the third movement of the Moonlight Sonata with the arpeggios. that's stopping on it's on the pickup, so stopping on the first, and then we have on the second, and then on the third, and then on the fourth. So again, one moment in each pattern where the brain really has to think about the next event. Okay. Skipping around. We always see this classical problem in our youngest students, the inability to play from anywhere but the beginning. They can't do anything but start over from their piece. And I think we've all fallen into the same trap at one point in our lives. So can we start from anywhere in the piece? I think this is so important. So I've heard many teachers, and I've started to do this also with my students, choose specific starting points in the piece. Like in a Bach fugue, for example, 7 or 8 starting points where the student can skip, or we can skip if we have a memory slip. So this is great. But also I think just, again, always in our practice, if we're skipping around, choosing random starting points. Not necessarily specifying, which is also good, but choosing random starting points, being spontaneous and being more random about our choices, about where, so we can actually start really at anywhere in our piece is so important. Is this practice only beneficial while being memorized? I think absolutely not. And a lot of these techniques I'm talking about are, I find, equally as effective with the score as without. So we're practicing to solidify our memory, but and I'll talk about coming back to the score to reinforce our visual cue much later in the lecture as well. So one thing specifically that I love to do in skipping around is, especially in sonatas or in pieces where we have a juxtaposed material that appears in 2 different keys, practicing a certain section of these, say, the exposition, and jumping immediately to what we have in the recap. So again, with the Opus 90, we have right to the recap. And then again, right back. Or maybe to here, and then didn't quite remember where I was for the recap. So I just reminded myself that it's E minor as opposed to B minor. So that was one little thought I had to just reinforce. So again, and then, and again back. Without a break. I find very, very useful to choose maybe 5 measures to 2 lines, maybe a small section, and go back and forth with no break, just to really reinforce, and so our hands and our brain both know exactly where we are in each key. So, so I think this is one of the most obvious and easy examples to use in the idea of skipping around, is this juxtaposed material when we have 2 different keys, but really throughout our pieces and our students' pieces, to find places to skip around and to always keep it spontaneous. Only beneficial while playing memorized? No, because we are changing the physical sensation, whether we are practicing with or without the score. So that's pertaining to our using the score. I think it's really beneficial either way. I have found practicing with the score helps me to solidify the memory as well. Okay. Different dynamics and articulation. So I love to do this because, again, it is an extreme changing of the physical sensation when we change a dynamic. So we change from the idea of maybe a scherzo to a nocturne to change the affect completely. Again, I think it can make slow practice or general practice much more interesting. It's a more musical and engaging way to play slowly or to use some of these techniques. and I think most importantly is that it really is such a change of physical sensation when you change the dynamic. So in the fourth scherzo, for example, we have this chordal section, sort of mezzo piano to piano. So practicing it loud feels so extremely different, drastically different to my hands. And so just that change of physical sensation is forcing automatically my brain to engage. So as well, in a soft section, in maybe Opus 90, and maybe digging in and playing a bit more legato. It feels a bit differently there, or just paying more attention to what's going on in the voicing, which I will get to later as well. So soft to loud, loud to soft, changing a dynamic it feels so different in the moment that it's forcing my brain to engage. And I can do this with the scherzo slowly as well. Or in the same dynamic as well. The importance is changing how we normally feel, how our muscles normally feel. Okay, let's see. Yeah, can make slow practice much more interesting, so much more interesting, really. I didn't address this specifically, but more legato or non-legato as well is again, it's a sort of a way of changing the dynamic, but more importantly, changing the physical sensation as well. Okay. Changing voicing. This is so fun. Great, of course, in fugues, pieces that are based in voicing, of course, but it doesn't just apply to fugues, I think. And once again, changing the voicing, any tempo that we do this at is beneficial. Either our normal tempo, the normal performance tempo, slow tempo, doesn't matter. And again, I think it also helps in exploration of phrasing and musical intent. So first I'm going to demonstrate the fugue of Beethoven 110, where by the time the third voice is entered, we have... Okay, so I would normally, of course, bring out the soprano, or whatever is my chosen voice to bring out becomes habitual. It becomes very much in my muscle memory. So changing which voice is brought out is, even again at performance tempo, whether it's slow or at performance tempo, is a change of physical sensation. So bringing out the alto, and then the bass. And I've had my students do this, and I think it's, of course, very important to do it musically, but the first time I have addressed this with my students often, I will tell them just to do it stupidly, loud, just to really specify and focus their sound in a voice that they're not used to bringing out. And of course, as I addressed before, at first they feel incredibly uncomfortable and very exposed and terrible about themselves and their playing, but after a few minutes you get used to it, and the reinforcement of the brain that occurs is great positive reinforcement, and how you feel it solidify immediately. A non-fugue example is the fourth scherzo. So I do this in this chorale. So bring out the alto. That was not good. And then the tenor. And then the bass. Again, it feels so foreign and so strange to my hands, so I have to really think, do I actually know the bass line. And practicing the voices alone, we always tell our students to do that, certainly in fugues. That's important as well. But to do it kind of similar and close to how it feels in performance by practicing all voices together, but bringing out a voice that we're not used to bringing out is a great altering and making it feel very foreign, changing that physical sensation again. Okay, so great in fugues, but not just applying there. Any tempo, helping exploration of phrasing and musical intent. I really do find that a lot of these are so engaging for the soul and the psyche, as well as engaging for the brain. So they're really fun. They can be, once you get used to them, fun to do. So this is not really an official name, but for me, this is the ultimate unnerving practice technique, which I'll demonstrate with Mozart 545. So. Ooh, I didn't know the left hand. So I actually take my hands off the piano. I keep the music running like a YouTube with the score running. And I choose a random spot. While the score has been continuing in my head, I choose a random spot to put my hands back on the piano. So I am actually, in this technique, actually removing the muscle memory completely, taking your hands off the piano. I find this is, for me, particularly useful in Baroque and classical repertoire, where we all, as pianists, feel much more exposed. There's not as much pedal, the harmonies are simpler, we just feel extremely exposed. So this kind of scrutinization in practice of actually taking your hands off and making sure that you really know exactly the note you're coming to on the score is very useful. But really in all repertoire, I just find it particularly useful in the Baroque and classical repertoire. So it removes the muscle routine from the equation completely. Okay. So up until now, I've been mostly addressing physical practice. But of course, there's a lot that we can do to engage our brain practicing away from the piano. A lot can be done away from the piano. So the first thing that obviously comes to mind is harmonic analysis. I think not just knowing the chords, or our students knowing the chords, but knowing how the chordal shifts occur, where are the common notes between chords. I think it helps us very particularly to be able to think ahead, which is so important in performance, if one is aware of the approaching chords. So I tell my students often to know at least the main harmonic shifts. When are we coming to the tonic and dominant? When are we coming to major harmonic points in the piece? It's also important to know every chord, of course, but to at least start from knowing the major points. Be aware of the large harmonic shifts. This is particularly useful when we're practicing skipping around, practicing juxtaposed sections. If we are able to really verbalize, and our students can verbalize the harmonic analysis and the chordal structures and the names of the chords, it really helps to engage our brain that way in using the skipping around technique. So, I keep forgetting I can do this one by one while I'm going. So the harmonic analysis is very important. And this brings me now to the cues that we have. We have three cues, basically: visual, aural, and physical, which I'll talk about specifically. In our visual, which I addressed before, this is such an important cue because we can come back to the score and reinforce how it looks. When I was young and just starting to memorize, I had this great fear that if I had memorized something and then I came back to the score, I would unmemorize it. And I think maybe all of our students experience this to a certain degree. But of course, that's not true. To be able to actually come back and reinforce how the notes look on the page, what we have written in our score, which I again think is so important to do in the earliest stages of learning a piece, and something visual that we can specify for ourselves, whether that's fingerings or symbols or something that pertains just to how we individually look at our score. So important: fingering, symbols, groupings. I think the earlier we can do that and the earlier we can write in our score, the more specifically the brain can engage. So coming back to the score and reinforcing that visual cue, I think, is so incredibly important and really essential, because I find when I'm on stage, I can see the score in front of me if I have done that work of reinforcing, coming back to the score and reinforcing the visual cue. Aural. This pertains to harmonies, obviously, harmonic analysis. Do we really know the harmonies deeply as well? Do we know the melodies deeply also? I know Seymour Bernstein is a friend of a lot of ours, and certainly a friend of Klavierhaus and the Piano Teachers Congress. I remember him specifically saying that he often asks his students, for example, in a Chopin nocturne, can they play the Chopin nocturne melody in the right hand with their left hand? And invariably, of course, they can't. So do we really know in our brain that melody deeply as much as we know the harmony? So that aural cue. For me, I do a lot of singing when I practice. And I think this is really so useful and so essential. Obviously, we can't sing in performance, but one of the things that I have done many times in performance when I've reached a stressful point or I feel a memory slip going on is I sing in my head. I sing along with the melody in my head, almost as if I'm visualizing myself standing solo on stage singing the melody. So I'm coming mentally and almost physically as close as possible to singing out loud, very specifically in my head, singing the melody along with myself, and that invariably gets me out of my head, stops me thinking about the technicalities of the memory slip I might be about to have, and back into the music and back into being absorbed in what I'm doing. So I think that's, of course, pertaining to this aural cue. And then physical. As much as we're talking about muscle memory and getting away from muscle memory, physical is a cue unto itself. I think dancers, of course, as far as I can tell, have an easier time remembering the next move because their entire body is involved in every minute of what they're doing. And for we pianists, it's minor muscle motion. So it's much more difficult and much less specified in a way than a full body choreography that a dancer does. So I think this is also why it's important to really, from the very early stages, specify our choreography and how we and our students are executing each phrase and each technical pattern and each note that we're playing. And I think our physical slips, from memory or otherwise, they're often a result of the physicality being not specific enough, being random, or not a conscious choice. So again, this is also why it's important to specify throughout our practice and also really from the early stages how specific that choreography is of us at the piano. As small as it is, and we can't be gesticulating around, and that doesn't serve our piano playing, but the specificity of our choreography even in the small scale that we use at the piano is so incredibly important. Because I think even a minor involvement of the wrist or the arm or the elbow is a very specific choreography, and this is something that the brain, again, can attach to. And so this is something that we're using our muscles for and maybe turns into muscle memory, but it's also something that if we have specified and have chosen a specific choreography, that's our brain attaching and specifying. So it's something we can draw on. And again, the earlier we make these physical cues, the better. I think this is not something I put in my PowerPoint, but something I added later. I also, when I have been dealing with students with smaller hands and leaving out notes or redistribution of things, I think also the making these choices as early on in the practice and as specifically as possible is so important for the brain's engagement and to physicalize it, but also making this into a conscious choice is so important. And again, I want to reiterate, can we practice a choreography into our hands even at a slow learning tempo? Absolutely. I think it might change over time or change as we increase the tempo slightly, but I think the more we can specify that and keep it as similar as possible from a slow tempo to a performance tempo is very important. And then lastly, practicing performing. How important is it? What do we achieve by it? I think it's important for us to recognize that the stage will always feel different than our practice a little bit by any degree. So how can we practice for our nerves? the introduction of nerves into our practice, I think, is the best way to expose the spots where our brain is not fully engaged. So I encourage my students, and I as well, performing for friends, performing for oneself, but committing to not stopping. This is very important. I think we can spend a little time on this. This is a trap that we can fall into so much, of developing the physical habit, actually, of stopping ourselves and correcting ourselves. We can easily fall into that trap. So I think when we're reaching the final stage of performance, and I encourage my students to do this all the time, to in a day of practice, if we're focusing on a certain piece, when you're at a certain point and you're getting to say a week before a performance, to have a run through of the piece and to develop that habit of running through, but also in terms of introducing nerves into the equation, the actual physical and mental act of sitting down and telling oneself that you cannot stop. You're about to run through your piece and you can't stop. Introduces a little bit of nerves. And I think that's a good way to, one good way to practice for these nerves. Recording ourselves is so important as well. Performing for friends, oneself, but not committing to stopping. I remember so specifically, really, a couple times in studio class, particularly in grad school, playing something I thought I felt so confident on, and I sat down and played, and I stopped in all of the spots that I was used to stopping and correcting myself habitually, as if it was part of my playing. It was really just so surreal. So, but I think it's happened to all of us. Recording is so useful. I think just the even as easy as it is now for we and our students to record ourselves, just putting our iPhone on the piano, it's still an outside body listening to us and creating, again, a little bit of nerves to, even on a very small scale, to experience those nerves is very useful for emulating what we're going to feel on stage, even though it's, of course, magnified on stage. Let's see. That's okay. This is one thing that I had not put in the PowerPoint, but in my notes, is that listening to recordings, I think as well, this is, as we know, it's kind of a lost art in our young students, something we all did obsessively and for recreation, but it's not something that students do as much for pleasure. But I think this is also, both before we learn a piece and also after we've learned a piece, coming back to recordings, this is also a way to engage our brain and to enhance what we maybe have not thought about, or where our brains have kind of gone on autopilot. It's a way to kind of connect the two, to reinforce our cues and to make sure that our brains, again, are engaged all the way. So just to kind of recap, removing the muscle memory is very important in terms of how we change our physical sensation and how we engage our brain. So we talked about slow practice, inconsistent tempos, changing voicing. Get this in order. Alternating rhythms, skipping around, different dynamics in articulation, changing voicing, and then actually taking the hands off of the piano to remove the muscle memory completely. And then our cues away from the piano, harmonic analysis, and then specifically the visual, the oral, and the physical cues. And then how important it is to practice performing, so we emulate our nerves on stage. Okay. So, any questions? I want to open it up for questions now. Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. This is really very, very interesting. So the very last thing that you said, recording, and then, so listening to recordings. Do you mean our own recordings or just
others?
Random?
Yeah, our own as well, but others. Just listening to performances and recordings. Yeah.
I think definitely can.
Yeah. And again, even though it's an outside entity, if we're listening to Zimmerman or another pianist play our piece, it's a way coming back to that. I find it's especially effective after I've learned the piece and have formed my own interpretation. Coming back to recording, really, I think, oh, this is something I didn't quite hear, or even tapping into something musically that that is introduced to me through refamiliarizing myself with a recording enhances that brain activity of, oh, I wasn't thinking about that musically, but maybe there's a note in there as well that I wasn't quite sure of. So it enhances those cues. Yeah.
I thank you very much. I read somewhere that Chopin was against memorizing music. He thought that it was impossible to follow every detail of a composition if the piece is memorized. And I've noticed that a lot of great artists often don't follow details.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes it doesn't matter, like in Mozart, where there aren't many details in the score, but sometimes I think it does matter, like, you know, in Schubert or Debussy or something like that. So I guess, and you know, we never memorize chamber music, and yet chamber music is just as virtuosic as solo piano music. So I guess the question that I have is, do you think that there will ever come a time when people don't memorize music?
I think so. I think that
the idea of memorizing music comes from a less scholarly time than ours. You know, a time when, you know, Liszt and so I don't know. I was at a performance a couple nights ago where it was the Chopin First Concerto, and the soloist had an iPad inside the piano, and you know, I was very surprised to see that. But it was a very good performance. So I don't know. What do you think that things will change in the future?
No, I certainly I've had a few performance experiences where it was a crazy, super difficult piece, and I wasn't able to learn it in time, and I used the score, and invariably nobody cares. So I think we can just address that. Nobody cares if it's memorized. But I think we all have experienced in having to memorize our music so much in our studies and applying this to our students that it is a very useful tool that I think sometimes I often feel that I can be more engaged if I do have it memorized, but there's so much added stress as well of having to memorize. So I think it's what stresses us out the most when we walk on stage. So Richard Good, for example, is famously playing most everything with score now. So they're really household name pianists that are doing this, and really nobody cares. Yeah, so I do think that it is possible that we might get to a time where we don't have music memorized. And I think the point you make about being so specifically attentive to details in the score, I think that's really valid, because I think we can lose sight of that when we're under the gun and we're trying to memorize something so quickly, a lot of things can fall by the wayside. So I think there's validity to both, for sure.
Hi, Spencer.
Hi, Luba.
Thank you. That was a fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
I was thinking about something you haven't mentioned, but I wonder if you use a technique of closing your eyes and trying to play.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
Totally
Absolutely.
like
Something I
tactile
don't
memory.
advocate enough with my students, but yes.
This is something that your teacher actually taught me doing, and I found this to this day very useful, both for myself and for my students as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and her mic is tapped through the live stream, right? So the live stream people can hear.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
just talking about closing your eyes in practice. Yeah, extremely useful, because that hand-eye coordination, I think, comes into our muscle memory habits. So to remove that is even though we're not necessarily changing the physical sensation of our hands, it's a way to it falls into these categories for sure.
Yeah,
of engaging
I
our brain.
almost feel like it actually does sometimes reduce unnecessary movement and changes the technique as well for the more efficient.
Yes, specifying and making it most efficient. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll start from I'll go this way.
Yeah. Yeah, go to David. Yeah.
Thank you, Spencer. This was awesome.
Sure.
I feel like your talk was kind of at the intersection of awareness and practice techniques.
Yeah.
And you spent most of the time talking about fabulous practice techniques designed to increase awareness. But if you don't mind, I'd like to focus more on the awareness.
Yeah, please.
And the general question is, what are you thinking about when you're performing? And I'll be a little more specific. When I have slips in performance, by memory or not, it's often when something gets into my awareness that wasn't previously in my awareness. And ideally, when you do all these techniques with the rhythms and the skipping around, etc., you're aware of everything, and yet that's probably not ever possible to be completely aware of everything. And also, if you're performing with other people, things happen to them. audiences make noises.
Right.
And also, let's say you've done all these techniques and you're still practicing. Where does your mind settle, and do you plan a route for your awareness for the concert? Do you understand?
Yeah.
There's so many different routes your mind can take.
Such a good question, multi-layered question. I think for me, the idea that I try to always maintain in this practice is that I am never completely aware and ready, that there's always more to do. Because I have also had the experience where I've done these techniques ad nauseum and still have had slips on stage, for sure. Because of, as you say, extraneous things come into play and things we don't expect. So I try to, in that vein, I often will focus these techniques on some of the more easy and unassuming spots in my pieces, because those are often where I have the most memory slips, where I least expect, where it feels the most comfortable generally, and I least expect to have a memory slip. So I find myself always trying to stop and say, okay, I went through that section too quickly, need to go back over that and do these techniques, and to never be quite so comfortable. So, but I think that, the more I can, in my practice, make sure that I am not feeling comfortable quite yet, then the more comfortable I can be on stage. So, and the more aware. So.
Do you think in the final three run-throughs of a piece before performance, your awareness is following more or less the same track through the piece?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. That's such a good question.
Hi, Spencer.
Yeah, hi.
Thank you for this talk. And what I really loved about it is that it's so much about improvisation and changing how you do things in a fun way, so that, because in a performance, things will change. Yeah. So if you're stuck in a rut, right, you have to be adaptable. So practicing how to be adaptable is great. And it's also fun, I think, for the students to do these different things.
Extremely.
So I wanted to just offer a couple of other ideas that I had so many ideas while you were talking that might be helpful for anyone who is interested. One thing I've read a long time ago is about these, we have two centers in the brain, one for slow movements, one for fast movements, or slow thinking and fast thinking, right? There's this book by Kahneman. And one exercise I really like is practicing one bar slowly and then fast, the same bar. Okay, you can put a metronome on a final tempo, play it half speed and then full speed. The next bar, half speed, full, and take time in between to relax. Right. So to kind of transfer from the slow, where we can really make sure everything's right, into the fast. In a way, we are building the muscle memory that way. Yeah. Because ultimately, we do depend on it. There's no way we can really think about every note as we're playing. Totally. And also, fight or flight response when we are, on stage, right? We fall back on the muscle memory as a sort of fail-safe mechanism.
Yes, exactly.
So to have that built is really important. And then other things I thought about, the rhythms practice. I like practicing 2 notes slow and then 2 notes fast, more than dotted rhythm, because that gives me time to relax. So physically also work on relaxation. Yeah. And then skipping around, I love that. What I do a lot is starting from the last measure in the piece, and then the penultimate measure, and then the one before. So you kind of build the piece backwards. It gives me a whole other level of security. Yeah. Especially because we practice those things last. Also because when we practice, our stream goes forward in the piece. Yes. Right? Yes. And so we're always tempted to not stop and keep practicing and playing the stuff we don't really know yet. Yeah. So if we start from the end, we always reinforce the good stuff that we just worked on. Exactly. And then voicing, what I've heard from a friend of mine is the idea of playing a fugue, but taking out one voice, but singing that voice instead. Oh, which is super hard. So play everything else, but sing the. Again, to practice kind of a musicality, but also the taking out the muscle memory. So sorry to kind of throw all this stuff at you. I love all those. I had so many ideas while you were talking, and also to respond maybe to the question about memorization. I think it was Clara Schumann who was the first who insisted on memorizing music.
Yeah.
And I think it was because her husband's music was so complex that there was no way to really look at the music and play it. You had to memorize it.
Yeah.
So even though I do agree we would love all to practice from the score, but in some ways it's impossible. And you really, you get to a whole other level of understanding and knowing the music and making it your own when you memorize, just like when you memorize a poem.
Exactly.
Right? You're getting, it's almost like you're making it your own and you're the one who's
the
giving
total
it out.
engagement
So
and the total absorption.
there is a really good thing about
more,
memory too.
Yeah.
So trying to defend memory too a little bit.
No, no, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we should have said that before, that it is so much of what we play is so complicated that it really, the being able to look down at the keys is very important. So it's often nearly impossible to play some of the things we do with the score in performance. So.
Okay, my question is not related to the mature performer. I'm talking about like for the young kids.
Sure, yeah.
Especially not advanced student. When you talk about irregular tempo, because in the early age, like I try to always emphasize keep steady beat.
Steady tempo, yeah.
Yeah, and then and also some of the students who are like thinking they're musical, they tend to just kind of like wander in the tempo. And then so I wonder like how you can make sure they understand when you do irregular tempo, it's not become like, so I guess how you're going to help the student to do the way, not misleading them.
Right, right. Well, I think the idea of really specifying that this is actually a technique and to have them explore how it feels to play it at an inconsistent tempo and then juxtapose as well a steady tempo is important because it specifies both ends for their brain.
Yeah.
How it feels to play it not consistently and how it feels to play it steadily.
So I guess, like when I teach a student, like I will have them to do different kind of tempo. But you were talking about in the same passage.
Yes.
They actually should do different tempo.
Yes, exactly.
And do you allow them to decide which part they want to do slow, fast, or you tell them?
Oh, I try to let them decide and explore and always reinforcing the importance of making it different every time. Where you're playing faster and slower and changing is always different every time.
Suggest them to do every time differently, not always the same. Okay, that's good. Thank you.
Yes.
This is super interesting, I
love it.
I knew. I mean, I've been excited about this workshop for since I got the announcement. I'm like, oh my God, I can't wait. So, but we've been talking about practicing slow, and I sometimes like to practice fast, like to extreme tempo. So, for example, because what it does to me is it pushes my brain to think quicker than I need to think.
Absolutely.
Especially if, for example, if I'm preparing for a chamber music piece, some with people that I don't know, and they are amazing, and I'm like, I don't know what kind of tempo is going to take. So I take the least possible playable tempo to make sure that when I see him,
you're ready for anything.
So but let's say, but that's like for the vanity moment, right? But I also like to just in general sometimes just push my brain to faster so that I don't feel comfortable. Now about memorization in general. Pre-COVID, I used to play all my concerts memorized. During the 2 years of, let's say, not seeing an audience at all, I remember the very first concert that I played, and it was in a speakeasy club. So I made sure that everybody was drunk, before I started playing. And I actually drank some too because I felt like I needed it as well. Yeah. But I also made sure that my iPad was there too, because I felt like I don't have that habit of anymore. Like I lost it and I lost something.
Absolutely.
But you know what? I also found that I found something also. Playing with the scores not only gave me the comfort of not thinking about memory slips, although I can tell you, even with the scores, you still have memory slips.
Definitely.
And this comes back to the fact that, when I learn, I memorize, obviously, because many of the passages are so fast, it's impossible even to read. So you memorize intentionally, then you practice with the scores intentionally to reinforce that visual memory. However, you also perform with the scores because even that moment you are seeing those details. I totally agree with that point.
Yeah.
And I think that it's kind of unfair to demand, expect the pianist to play memorized while the soloists of other instruments, violin or cello or whatever, they're somehow expected to be not judged at all, playing their Brahms sonata, with the scores.
Yep.
The singer is a totally different thing. It's acting. So it would be difficult to say, I love you. But what are you doing to me now?
Right.
So it's a different, aspect at all.
Yeah.
So, but if you're playing, music that has no lyrics,
Right.
no words,
When you don't have a
then
dual
it's a
cue
different
of
kind
lyrics
of a thing.
and music. Yeah. Yeah.
So just thoughts, and those are millions.
Yeah. Great thoughts. Great thoughts.
Too many thoughts, especially sometimes. Oh, one last thing. I don't want to take too much time. I worked a lot with dancers, with contemporary and ballet dancers, and I remember one of these teachers who was amazing. Was talking about the pirouettes, etc. And she said, the second that you think you will fall, you will fall. And I took it to myself. I'm like, this is crazy. The second that I think I will forget, I forget.
Absolutely.
Especially so this neuromuscular connection is insanely strong, which for me, and you say, where are you, consciously, right?
Yeah.
Your awareness. My awareness is I try consciously keep myself to the positive side, enjoying side. I tell myself enjoy. I sometimes sing.
Yeah, that's where
not
singing
out loud,
becomes
because
that,
otherwise I don't want to be like Glenn Gouldish. This is
No.
very, very distracting, to be honest. As much as I love him, but consciously being there. And the
Present.
moment I zone out, I push myself, like get back. So it's crazy.
Yeah.
But back.
Yeah. Performing is a big mind game. Yeah.
Thank you, Spencer. Amazing workshop,
Well, thank you.
amazing lecture. Thank you so much. Just wanted to share something. So when I was, 17, I was taking part in this piano competition in Italy. And I got to the final, and I had to practice. And, the piano practice room didn't have the AC, like most practice rooms in Italy, and concert halls. And it was about 105 degrees.
Oof.
And I had to practice for like 4 or 5 hours that day. The bench was almost broken, like it was so low and uncomfortable. The piano was missing a few keys. So it was interesting environment when you really had to struggle, not just physically, but also mentally, in this, oh my God, what's going on?
Yeah.
And then you're very sweaty, but you still have to keep going and maybe do a few run-throughs to make sure that you have this stamina to play your program, which is 40, 45 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So then when the performance day came and the bench was fine, the piano was much better. It was still hot, but it felt better after that torture of practicing, right? So then I remember going back to St. Petersburg, and I was talking to some of my classmates, and they were like, I practiced Mephisto waltz. I decided to practice my jumps wearing gloves. And then the other pianist says like, I also did it, and I also turned the lights off. And he's like, hold on, you did it like in gloves with the lights off? I was like, oh my goodness, like all these creeps that I study with.
Wow.
So my question is like, have you personally done anything like that when you push yourself to that level of discomfort for practicing, which when you go and you perform, everything seems easier?
Yeah. I would say it's not something I've done enough consciously, but those kind of experiences have happened to me as well. Not quite that bad, but but I remember Julian Martin told me that Fleischer, before he went on stage, would practice everything slowly and piano. So almost like you're referring to, sort of, that his body is craving to do it in the normal setting. And so it just feels so good when he walks on stage, because he's sort of created a prison for himself the hour or two before he goes on stage by practicing everything softly and slowly. So it's all contained, and he feels contained, so that when he's on stage, it feels so good. Yeah, so it
Thank you so
enhances
much.
that mental, yep.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a pedagogical question.
Yeah.
When you're preparing your Spencer's on faculty at Indiana University and has a full studio there, but when you're preparing your students for recitals and they're playing full programs, do you go through these same methods when you're preparing your students as well, and they're playing longer programs? Like, do you alternate? How do you prepare them for the stage with longer pieces, not just one?
Yeah, kind of the same, kind of the same way.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have noticed in my own teaching style is that while I try to be very specific, I generally, and you remember this from our lessons, I generally do, when they bring a piece, a 10-minute piece, we generally do get through the whole thing in the lesson. As much as it feels great to focus on 2 lines for a whole lesson, I feel that by the way my own approach and the fact that they do get through the piece in their lesson and we address lots of things, the idea of being able to get through the piece is enhanced. So I think as much as I have worked with teachers that focus on very small specific spots in a lesson, as much as that is great, I think that a student can fall into a certain prison, as I just said, of being of not having exercised that muscle of being able to get through the piece. So certainly at the final stages of preparing a recital, I set up run-throughs and I encourage them to play multiple times in studio class, and the idea of, as I said finally in the lecture, of practicing for the nerves, introducing the nerves in any way, and I encourage them to get their friends together and play through, and so the developing the stamina of playing multiple pieces or playing a long program is very important. But that, for me, that starts from the early stages of lessons where we're addressing the piece specifically enough, but also as a whole, that they're finding that muscle within themselves of being able to address it as a whole. Yeah.
Any other questions? Alex?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's, really interesting stuff. I guess I have a comment on memory.
Yeah.
In terms of using this score or not, it kind of makes me think of like an actor going off book, and that they know a character really well. They know what that character eats for breakfast, even though that doesn't happen maybe in the production. But just having that flexibility to jump in at any point and kind of be in character.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, separate from that, in some of the physical preparation too, and engaging like the nervous system or how your body feels in this practicing performing, and if you do any sort of physical exercises or visualization or something away from the piano, even to like raise your heart rate or something before you maybe do some jumping jacks and then do a run through, or you plant some distractions, and if there's any variation, I guess, if you're preparing a student or preparing yourself for either an audition or competition versus like a concert or a recording session even.
Yeah. I would say not really specific things like jumping jacks, like you said, but more awareness. So for me, one of the important things that I am often not aware of is my breathing. So I try to remind myself all the time to keep my breathing healthy and rhythmic and make sure I am breathing, because we so often forget to breathe when we're nervous. So I encourage my students to do the same, and to be also just very aware of posture and how they hold their body and how that can change when we're nervous, or even not when we're nervous, but when we're feeling expressive. To be very specifically aware of where their shoulders are sitting, and again, specifying so much the feeling and the location of every body part when you're sitting at the piano, to keep that specified in one's brain, I think. So not necessarily specifically doing something, but more awareness I do that a lot for myself and for my students. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it.
The jumping jacks reminded me of one of my favorite stories. A violist classmate that auditioned for orchestral positions straight out of college and didn't get any, and then decided to do a lot of analyzing of the process. One of the things she shared with all of us is she would run in place and then stand on a chair and then run her audition, because that's what it felt like, the accelerated heart rate and then feeling like you're really on the spot. And the second year she went for auditions, she got a seat in the Los Angeles Philharmonic. So it worked for her, yeah.
Wow, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I think that the recording ourselves is so important also because the developing of the skill of listening outside of ourselves as a pianist is so impossibly hard. And comes with over time, but can be that skill can be really accelerated by recording ourselves. So that's also why I encourage my students, not just enhancing the muscle memory and exposing things for themselves and increasing the nerves, but being able to listen outside of themselves. And I often, when they're preparing for something, taking that into account, I often tell them to put the recording away for a day and then come back and listen to it. So it's a little more objective. It's so hard to listen objectively to ourselves if we record ourselves and listen immediately. So.
How much, like in advance, like how long before the actual performance would you say record yourself?
I don't know, maybe stop 2 or 3 days before the performance, because I think you can, at a certain point you can kind of get in your head. But I think the use of the tool of recording can be done from day one.
Oh, that
Really?
way.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying, let's say, for example, I'm performing like in a week, and you're like, how about, record yourself? I don't know, maybe a week would be.
Yeah, I think the
all right.
first,
But
the
like
first
if I
4 to
listen to
5
my
days of the
recording like a day before the performance, I will cancel the concert.
Right, exactly, yes. No, there is a stopping point. Yeah. For sure.
All right, I do think we have to wrap up. Can we please have a round of applause for
Thank
Spencer?
you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank Spencer for being here, because so many of these techniques I actually use in my own practice, especially the one where you stop and then come back in,
Amazing.
which is terrifying when you're
Terrifying.
practicing.
It feels
And
terrible, but
it's
useful.
so great for mapping things out in your head and just really
Yeah.
feeling secure. So,
Good.
Spencer,
Good.
thank you so
Thank you for
much.
having me.
Thank you
Yeah.
all so much for being here. You can
Yes.
read about Spencer on our website, also on his website, and about his extensive performing career. I had the pleasure of hearing his Opus 90 just a few days ago. It was so phenomenal. So anyway, thank you, Spencer, and I hope everyone will come back on May 26th at 2 p.m. to hear the complete Debussy Preludes, and you have other performances coming up all over the U.S.
Yep.
So thank you so much,
Great.
Spencer. Round of
Thank
applause. And
you.
can we all take a picture together? Can we all come
Thanks,
up
guys.
for a photo?